The bustling city street was alive with movement, but for James Carter, a kind-hearted elderly man in a wheelchair, it was just another day. Rolling along the sidewalk, he minded his business, unaware that trouble was lurking just ahead. Officer Daniels, a hot-headed cop with a reputation for abusing his authority, was patrolling the area when he spotted James. Without a second thought, the officer assumed the worst. "Hey, stop right there," Daniels barked, storming toward him. James barely had time to react before the officer roughly shoved his wheelchair, knocking him to the ground. Bystanders gasped, some pulling out their phones to record. But Daniels wasn't concerned. He had no idea who James really was. Moments later, sirens blared, and a sleek black car screeched to a halt. The sheriff stepped out, his face dark with rage. As he locked eyes on James, his father, the entire street fell silent. The sheriff's hands clenched into fists as he rushed toward his father, his heart pounding. James groaned, struggling to sit up as a couple of bystanders helped him. The officer took a step back, his confidence wavering. "What the hell happened here?" the sheriff demanded, his voice sharp. Daniels straightened his posture, trying to mask his nerves. "Sir, I was just handling a situation. This man was acting suspiciously." The sheriff's eyes darkened. "Suspicious? That's my father." His words hung heavy in the air. Daniel's face drained of color. He glanced around, realizing the growing crowd had their phones aimed at him. The weight of his mistake settled in, but he still tried to defend himself. I didn't know." "That's the problem," the sheriff interrupted. His voice was calm, but his fury was clear. James finally looked up at his son. "Is this how your officers treat people?" The sheriff took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he helped his father back into his wheelchair. The weight of the moment hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension. Officer Daniels stood frozen, his mind racing. He had messed up, badly. But instead of owning up to it, he clung to his pride. "Look, Sheriff, I was just doing my job," Daniels muttered. "I didn't mean any harm." James shook his head. "Doing your job? By knocking me to the ground without asking a single question." His voice was calm, but there was disappointment in his eyes. The crowd murmured in agreement. A young woman stepped forward, her phone still recording. "We saw everything. You didn't even hesitate." The sheriff turned back to Daniels. "How many times has this happened before? How many people don't have someone to stand up for them?" Daniels swallowed hard, but before he could answer, another officer rushed over, looking nervous. "Sheriff, we've got a problem," he said. "The mayor just called. He saw the video." The sheriff glanced around, realizing how quickly this was spiraling. This wasn't just a bad decision. It was about to become a citywide scandal. And Daniels? He still had no idea just how deep he was in. Daniels' pulse quickened as he processed what was happening. The mayor had seen the video. That meant the whole city was watching. His career, his reputation, everything was slipping away. He looked at the sheriff, hoping for a way out, but there was no mercy in his eyes. The sheriff turned to James. "Are you hurt?" His voice was softer now, laced with concern. James nodded slowly. "I'll be all right, but this isn't just about me. How many others have been treated like this?" The crowd stirred, voices growing louder. Some people were angry, others just shocked. A man in a business suit spoke up. If this wasn't the sheriff's father, would anyone have cared? Would he have just gotten away with it? Daniels exhaled sharply. "I was just following protocol." The sheriff's stare hardened. "Then maybe the problem is bigger than just you." More officers arrived, forming a tense line near the scene. The air was thick with anticipation. James looked around at the faces, some demanding justice, others fearful of what might come next. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. And then a voice cut through the chaos. "Sheriff, we need a decision. What happens now?" The city was waiting. Before the sheriff could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Another call from the mayor. But just as he reached for it, a voice from the crowd made everyone pause. "I know this officer," an older man in a faded security uniform said, stepping forward. "This isn't the first time he's done something like this." All eyes shifted to him. Daniels stiffened. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. The man shook his head. "2 years ago, my nephew got stopped by you. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but you accused him of stealing his own bike. You never filed a report, just let him go when you realized he had proof." He turned to the sheriff. "How many of these incidents never made it onto your desk?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. The sheriff's expression darkened. He had trusted his officers, but now doubt crept in. Then, another voice spoke up. "My brother had a run-in with him too. He never even reported it because he was scared." Daniel's confidence cracked. "This is ridiculous," he said quickly, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Phones were still recording, and now people were digging into his past. Then came the second blow. One of the newly arrived officers hesitated before stepping forward. "Sheriff, I think there's something you need to see." He handed over a tablet with live social media updates. The video had gone viral, but worse, more stories were coming out. Complaints, reports, things that had been buried were now resurfacing. The sheriff's stomach sank. This wasn't just one bad decision. This was a pattern, and now the whole city knew. The sheriff's grip tightened around the tablet as he scrolled through the mounting accusations. Each post, each story, was another crack in the foundation of trust he had built with his department. He turned to Daniels, who was visibly shaken now. "You've been hiding behind the badge," the sheriff said, his voice steady but cold. "But not anymore." Daniels swallowed hard. "Sheriff, Save it," the sheriff interrupted. "Hand over your badge and gun." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some cheered, others watched in stunned silence. Daniels hesitated, but the weight of the moment crushed his resistance. With shaky hands, he unhooked his badge and placed it in the sheriff's outstretched palm. Just as the tension seemed to settle, another officer rushed forward. "Sir, Internal Affairs just called. They've been investigating Daniels for months. They're on their way." The sheriff exhaled sharply. "They knew, and no one told me." A new kind of realization dawned on him. This wasn't just about one officer. Corruption had been festering under his nose for years. He had been blind to it, until now. James, still in his wheelchair, looked up at his son. "So, what are you going to do about it?" The sheriff met his father's gaze, then turned back to the crowd. "Clean house," he said, his voice unwavering. "Starting now." As Daniels was escorted away, the sheriff knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. The sheriff turned to his father, his expression softer now. "I should have seen this sooner," he admitted. James gave a small nod. "What matters is what you do next." The sheriff knew his father was right. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about rebuilding trust, making sure this never happened again. He signaled for his team. "Start pulling records. Every complaint, every report. We're not sweeping anything under the rug." A sense of hope settled over the scene. The people who had come forward finally felt heard. Justice wasn't just a word, it was action. As James rolled forward, he glanced up at his son. "Proud of you," he said simply. The sheriff took a deep breath. This was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing the right thing.